Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are going to do a deep dive into a really fascinating report that I think you'll all find pretty interesting. It's called 2024 What is in Mind Special Edition, Mapping Global Trends Through Data. It's all about looking at the top websites in the world and really getting a digital snapshot of what was on everybody's minds online last year.
Yeah, that's right. It's an analysis of the global top 50 website rankings, which is a really interesting way to look at sort of the collective behavior of what users are doing online and really what they're interested in across different countries.
And I think the mission for us today in this deep dive is to kind of distill all of that down to the key takeaways and hopefully highlight some surprising facts and get to the bottom of what was on our minds collectively online in 2024.
Exactly.
So let's jump right in. The report kicks off with the worldwide top 5 content categories in 2024, and the categories that made it to the top were computer and electronics, news, adult, arts, entertainment, and shopping.
Yeah. And what's striking right off the bat is that the top three categories are computer and electronics, news, and adult. I mean, those are clearly the most popular ones worldwide.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty potent combination at the top there. You've got this interest in technology, you've got the news, and then you've got, the significant amount of interest in adult entertainment. I mean, is there anything that we can read into those top three? Why do you think those three specifically are so popular?
Well, I think that the high ranking of computer and electronics alongside news really suggests that a lot of people online are really focused on technology and accessing and understanding information, especially, I think, as it pertains to technology itself.
Okay.
So, product information, tutorials, tech news, it creates almost like a self-sustaining kind of a cycle of interest there.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And then you've got the consistent presence of the adult category, which I don't think is going to surprise too many people. I think it reflects really basic, fundamental human interests. And, the internet provides a level of accessibility unlike any other medium.
Yeah, makes sense. So it's sort of a combination of, this sort of inherent fascination with the tools and the information that really shapes our lives. I mean, technology's everywhere these days.
Absolutely.
But then also, some of the other things that humans are interested in are reflected there in that top three.
Exactly.
So let's see how this global picture plays out in different parts of the world.
Okay.
Because the report goes on to break things down by continent, and that's where things get really interesting because these global trends start to take on a little bit of local flavor depending on where in the world you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do see some common threads across continents, but I think these continental breakdowns show us that online interests aren't really a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. You know, distinct regional preferences definitely do emerge.
So let's start our continental tour down in South America. The top 5 categories there in 2024 were computer and electronics, news, arts, entertainment, and then we've got sports and finance rounding out that top 5. So that's a pretty notable departure from the global top categories, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think the inclusion of sports and finance in South America's top categories is really interesting. I mean, it raises a compelling question. What factors are really driving this unique interest? And I think right off the bat, the cultural importance of sports in a lot of South American nations is well known.
Right.
So could this also reflect a really engaged online sports culture there, with fans seeking out news and streaming and, online communities for sports?
Yeah.
And similarly, the prominence of finance might suggest maybe a heightened awareness or engagement with economic matters in the region.
Yeah, I mean, the passion for sports in South America is undeniable. I mean, football or soccer is huge down there.
Absolutely.
So it would make sense that that translates into some pretty significant online activity. All right, let's shift gears a bit and head north to North America. Their top 5 in 2024 were computer and electronics, news, shopping, arts, entertainment, and adult. What stands out to you when you compare that list to what's going on in South America?
I think the most obvious difference is that shopping has replaced sports and finance in the North American top categories.
Right.
And when you look at that from a broader perspective, I think this could reflect the really well-established online shopping culture that we have in North America, and maybe some different economic priorities or even just different consumer behaviors there compared to South America. It could be pointing to a greater emphasis on online commerce as a key area of internet use there.
Yeah, and I think that sort of tracks with a lot of people's perception of North America, that there's a strong consumer culture there.
Absolutely.
So it makes sense that that would be reflected in what people are doing online. Okay, so now let's journey across the Pacific over to the massive Asia-Pacific region. What were the online interests looking like there in 2024?
Well, for Asia Pacific, the top five were computer and electronics, news, arts, entertainment, adult, and shopping. So you can see a pretty significant alignment with both the global ranking and North America there.
So a little bit more consistency there.
Yeah.
The technology and news are still, front and center. The entertainment factor is clear. And then both adult and shopping are kind of in that top tier. I mean, were there any nuances or any, little differences that stood out to you in the Asia Pacific breakdown?
Well, I think it's important to remember just the sheer diversity within the Asia Pacific region, right? I mean, we're talking about a massive number of different countries with very different cultures
Yeah.
and very different economic situations. So even though the categories are similar to the global and the North American lists, even subtle differences in the specific rankings within those top five categories, which we don't see in this summary, could indicate maybe varying levels of emphasis and engagement across, the multitude of cultures and economies that are present in Asia Pacific. It's at a really massive and really multifaceted online landscape.
Yeah, definitely. So finally, let's take a look at Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, which is sometimes grouped together as the EME region. Their top five in 2024 were computer and electronics, news, arts, entertainment, shopping, and adult. Again, a lot of overlap with what we've seen already.
Yeah, the EMEA region's top categories definitely echo the global trends, and we see strong alignment with North America and Asia Pacific. The presence of computer and electronics, news, arts, entertainment, shopping, and adult really underscores that those have a really widespread appeal. Again, just like with the Asia Pacific region, it's important to remember that EMEA encompasses this huge diversity of different countries. So these top categories are really a valuable high-level overview, but, significant variations in online interests are almost certainly going to exist at the country level within EMEA.
Yeah, makes sense. So the report also includes a really interesting visual aid that it calls 2024 What is in Mind Map Chart. Now, obviously, our listeners can't see that, but what would you say is the main message that this map is trying to convey?
Well, I think the map serves as a powerful visual confirmation of these regional variations we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it literally maps out how website usage patterns differ in different geographical locations around the world. And so you get this really immediate, at-a-glance understanding of which content categories are most popular in different parts of the world. And I think it really just drives home the point that online interests are not at all uniform, and they do have these distinct regional characteristics.
So as we start to kind of wrap up here, what are the key takeaways that really jump out at you from this deep dive into, what the world was doing online in 2024?
Well, I think the main global trends that we've seen clearly point to the popularity of computer and electronics, news, arts, entertainment, and shopping. These are clearly the dominant categories worldwide.
Right.
But I think the most interesting thing is how these categories shift a little bit when we look at different continents. And I think the South American emphasis on sports and finance really stands out as a particularly interesting regional distinction.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, it really kind of begs the question, how much of this online behavior is actually a reflection of what's going on in the real world in these different regions, right?
Yeah.
So are we seeing sort of, cultural values and, maybe even, big events or economic realities kind of shaping what people are clicking on in different parts of the world?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question for the listener to ponder as well, right?
Yeah.
Considering these regional variations, what connections can you draw between what people are interested in online and the real-world dynamics in those continents?
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. So we've explored what captured the world's online attention in 2024 through this really insightful analysis of global website rankings. We've seen some universal interests emerge, but I think even more interesting than that, we've seen these really distinct regional patterns in what people are doing online.
Yeah, that's right.
And so as a final thought for everyone listening, looking back at these trends from 2024, what do you think are going to be the biggest shifts in global online interests in the coming year? What new or maybe what kind of niche categories are we going to see really explode in popularity? And what forces, whether it's societal, technological, cultural, right, what forces do you think are going to drive these changes in, our always changing digital world?
It's an exciting time to be following these trends for sure, because things are always changing. And I think these kinds of snapshots that we get from these reports are a really fascinating window into that transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.